Welcome students. Chapter 9 The Time Machine. The program BSc, a subject language English semester 4th semester 30 session 32 The Time Machine. Here in this session we are going to discuss the chapter wise summary or reveal the chapter wise summary created by Ravi Kumar A. Department of English, Government First Aid College, Yelahanka, along with Dr. Suresh S.B. Here we have this time miniature of the time machine H.G. Wells, in which he traveled across the future to the future. The chapter wise summary in the beginning, the first chapter. In the first chapter, it's called as introduction. In the time machine, there is a story within a story. The first chapter makes the outer story the frame that follows in the time traveler's story. It is important to consider why Wells included a frame story. It lets the reader know that the story takes place in Victorian England, in a world of gas lamps, cigars, gentlemen, and with the leisure time to discuss topics like the fourth dimension. It also sets up a good deal of suspense. The traveler is in his home, speaking to a group of men that includes the narrator. He is lecturing on the fourth dimension. He tells them that a cube exists not only in space but also in time. The time is the fourth dimension. Many of them are disbelieving. The time traveler claims that one should be able to move about in the fourth dimension just as one can move about in the other three. After all, he notes, we are constantly moving forward in time. Why not move faster and slower or even backward? Chapter 2, The Machine. He produces a miniature time machine the size of a clock, size of a clock in the sense size of a wall clock. It's a miniature made of ivory and crystal. The time traveler explains that one lever sends the machine into the future and the other one sends it into the past. He asks one of the guests to push the forward lever and the machine disappears in a small gust. He claims that the time machine is now gliding forward into the future. The guests ask why they cannot still see it, since they too are moving into the future, and the time traveler explains that it is moving forward too quickly to be seen, like the spokes of a wheel or a speeding bullet. The guests are amazed. The time traveler then shows them a much larger machine with which he plans to explore time. Chapter 3, The Time Traveler Returns. In this chapter, the narrator concludes that not many of the guests believed the time traveler as he was. See, there is a juxtaposition, enjambment between the chapters where one slide continues as the next para. I mean, one chapter continues moves to the other as a next para in an essay. Likewise, just their parts, they are made parts by giving particular names, names like this. And in the chapter 3, the time travel returns. In the chapter, the narrator concludes that not many of the guests believed the time traveler, as he was a very intelligent man, likely to play elaborate pranks. The narrator returns to dinner at his house the next week. The guests include some of the men from the previous week and some new guests. They have been instructed to begin dinner without their host. When they enters, he is incredibly dusty and disheveled. He quickly drinks some champagne and then goes to wash up. The narrator suggests to the others guests that their host has been traveling in time. The others are incredulous and make sarcastic remarks to replay. When the time traveler is finally ready to tell his story, the guest quickly raise objections. The time traveler says that he has no energy to argue and will speak only if everyone agrees not to interrupt. The guests agree. The time traveler says that he has no energy to argue and will speak only if everyone agrees not to interrupt in between. The guests agree and sit in increasingly rapt attention as the story begins. The time traveler gets an his machine and pushes on the day when he started his time traveling. On the day, the time traveler gets on his machine and pushes the forward lever just a little. It feels a dizzying sensation, and when he looks at the clock in his lamp, he sees that 5 hours have passed. He then presses the forward lever a bit more. Night and day fly by in increasingly rapid succession. Soon the lamp disappears. He can see the hazy outlines of a building as well as the sign going in a continuous path across the sky that moves up and down with the seasons. He becomes very frightened and pulls the lever to a stop. He ends up flying headlong through the air. The traveler finds himself in a hailstorm. He notices a giant statue of a white sphinx on a pedestal. He begins to fear what a man may have evolved into. Perhaps it is something very cruel or savage. He notices large buildings on the right side. He notices that small figures in rich robes are observing him from the nearest building. One creature approaches him. It is very frail, reminding the time traveler of someone afflicted by tuberculosis. The chapter 5 in the golden age, the time traveler gets on his machine and pushes the forward lever just a little after stopping. He feels a dizzying sensation, and when he looks at the clock in his lab, he sees that the 5 hours has passed. Then he passes the forward lever a bit more night and day and the lamps and feeling headlong motion turns his acceleration. He begins to worry when he stops the machine. It will land with their way where there is already some solid object and he will be obliterated. He becomes very frightened and pulls the lever to stop. He ends up flying headlong through the air. See, once when he landed on somewhere in the future, he tries to he pulls back the lever and it stops abruptly, and it makes him fly headlong through the air and falls outside of the time machine. The traveler finds himself in a hailstorm. As it passes, he notices a giant statue of a white sphinx on a bronze pedestal. There he finds a big sphinx head of some, it's like Egyptian sphinx on a bronze pedestal. He begins to fear that man may have evolved into. Perhaps it is something very cruel or savage. He notices large buildings and as he returns his head machine over on the right side, he notices that some figures in rich robes are observing him from the nearest building. One of the creatures approaches him. It is beautiful but very frail, reminding the time traveler of someone afflicted by tuberculosis. More of the creatures surround him, speaking in a sweet and liquid tongue. They seem free of fear and he feels safe. He removes the control levers from his time machine so that no one else can use it. The creatures have large eyes. The creatures which he finds in the future, curly hair and then thin red lips. When he points up to the sun to try to explain where he has come from, one of the creatures makes the sound of thunder, thinking that he came from the hailstorm. He wonders if they are fools and is fooled with the disappointment. They begin to run about and shower him with the strange flowers, and he laughs at how wrongly he had imagined the future. Creatures take the traveler into one of the large buildings. It is covered with the strange hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics. They give him a meal of a strange fruit. He tries to learn a few words. They laugh at his attempts to speak their language and soon grow weary of teaching him. They seem foolish. He walks out to explore the world of 802 701 AD. There are ruins. He notices that all of the creatures live together in a huge building. When the time traveler walks out of explore the world of 801, 802, 701 AD, there are ruins. He notices that there are no outward signs of gender and that there are no old people. He thinks he has arrived in a communist paradise and that these creatures are the result of a world without hardship and fear. In this chapter 6, the sunset of mankind. In this chapter, the time traveler thinks he has arrived in a communist paradise and that these creatures are the result of a world without hardship and fear. Wells uses his story to talk about contemporary social questions such as the advent of communism. The time traveler links that these frail creatures and their communal lifestyle is the result of a world free of trouble. While this seems desirable, it also seems strange. The time traveler finds the creatures beautiful, but he is disappointed by their laziness and lack of intelligence. It seems that Wells may be making a negative comment on communalism. Later, his story will seem to illustrate the problems of capitalism as well as the time traveler is reflecting on his theories. So I move to chapter 7. As I told earlier, it has a complete notion of continuing from chapter to chapter, like an enjambment. A night begins. So here in this chapter 7, the sudden shock, as the time travel is reflecting on his theories, night begins to fall. He heads back to his time machine. As he approaches the spot from a distance, the machine appears to be gone and he breaks into a desperate run. It is gone. He is sure that no one traveled in time because he took the levers, but someone has obviously moved it in space. He believes that the creatures he has encountered so far are too weak to move the machine. He goes into a frenzy running around the Sphinx statue, where he startles to a white creature that runs away. He goes into the hall and wakes the sleeping creatures, demanding his time machine in a gruff manner, which scares the creatures. The narrator climbs down and tries to reason out where his machine might be and how he can get it back. That morning, the traveler decides that since he was only away from that machine for a short time, it can't have gone very far. He concludes that the machine must be hidden in the immense pedestal of the Sphinx statue. He tries to open the pedestal's panel with a rock, but does not succeed. When he asks the creatures how to open it, they react with shock and disgust. He decides that he must be patient and that it would be a good idea to get to know the creatures better. He learns more of their language and explores the area. He pays more attention to the wells dotting the landscape and notes that air seems to be sucked down into them. He can hear the dull sound of machines coming from the below. The time a traveler notices that there are only buildings and that the clothes of creatures must be made somewhere. He also doesn't understand the strange wells and how his time machine had disappeared. Meanwhile, the time traveler rescues one of the creatures from the drowning in the river, which has shifted a mile or so from the bed of the Thames. Her name is Veena, the girl whom he saved from drowning. Her name is Veena, and she seems like an affectionate, precocious child to him. He greets him. She greets him when he returns to the area of the White Sphinx statue, making it feel like a home. Like the other creatures, she is very afraid of the dark. Her fellow creatures sleep in great clumps in the halls of the buildings, and she is very unwilling to let the narrator sleep elsewhere. One morning, the narrator wakes up at dawn and goes out on the porch of one of the buildings. He imagines he sees white figures moving around in the dull pre dawn light. On his fourth morning, he enters an old ruin and finds two big eyes staring back at him. It is a white ape like creature. The animal flees stumbling through the daylight. He tries to track it, but it seems to have disappeared down one of the nearby wells. He assumes from his new creature's appearance and behavior that it lives underground, and he begins to understand the wells as being a huge ventilation system of an underground race. He imagines that the underground creatures are the laborers of the future society and that they are only allowed to come out at night. He imagines that the overworld creatures have forced the underground creatures to work for them and have denied them the rights to live on broad light. He soon learns from the peaceful surface creatures that these underground creatures are called Morlocks and that the surface creatures themselves are called Eloi. When he tries to ask Veena more questions about Morlocks, however, she becomes very upset and she tries to disappear from that scene. Chapter 9, The Morlocks. It's exclusively talks about the Morlocks and their behavior, their lifestyles, and their living style. The time traveler concludes that in order to recover his machine, he must enter into the world of Morlocks. In the distance, he sees the what he describes the palace of green porcelain. Instead of visiting it, he decides that he must descend into one of the wells. When Veena sees him descend, she is very worried. He he clambers down one of the wells for a long time, finally finding a small alcove where he can rest. He awakes to the touch of clumsy figures lighting a match. He sees several Morlocks running into the distance. He explores further and finds a vast clump chamber filled with Morlocks and the throbbing machines that pump air through the caves. The Morlocks are eating some kind of meat which is laid on a table. Suddenly, the matches that he using to ward off the Morlocks. Suddenly, the Morlocks started to attack him, and he uses the matchsticks to get rid of them. By seeing the matchstick fire, the Morlocks runs Morlocks run helter skelter, and they run out. He narrowly escapes back up the well, horribly frightened. He decides that he must find some way to defend himself from the Morlocks. The chapter 10, when night came, he has to revise his theories over the next few days. He realizes that the meat which he saw in Morlock's shelters was not meat the Morlocks were eating was probably Eloy's meat. The Eloys are hunted during the night and keeping Eloy's flesh as their food. He decides to try to find safety in the palace of green porcelain. When Veena on his shoulders, he begins to journey towards it. Veena walks alongside him for a while, stuffing his pockets with flowers, two of which he produces for his guests in when he returns back and resumes his story to his guests. The journey takes longer than he thought. The time traveler is out of matches and is afraid to enter the woods with Morlocks about. He sets Veena down on top of a hill and lets her sleep while he keeps watch. The night passes without harm. So, Palace of Green Porcelains. Okay, on that day they were not visited. They are not entered into the Green Porcelains. However, it's getting dark, and he felt afraid. For possibilities of Morlocks attacks are very thick. So, by taking Veena, went outside and spent his night and returned back to the green force line building, the palace. The Veena and the time traveler enter the palace of green porcelain and find that just as it appears, it is made out of green porcelain. They also find that it is a ruined museum. Among a chemistry exhibit, the time travel salvages some camphor, an inflammable substance often used in torches, such as nothing but karpura. He is thrilled to find some preserved matches had run out, and however he had run out of matchsticks, and he marvels to the completely decayed remains of books that he finds in one of the halls, exploring a giant hall of machinery. He notices that Veena is scared, looking in the dark end of the hall. He hears the sound of Morlocks. He breaks a lever of one of the machines and flees, exiting the museum. He intends to rush back to the area of the Sphinx statue, but he is exhausted because he has not slept in 2 days, 2 continuous days. As they near the woods, they hear Morlocks beginning to stir behind him. Night has fallen. Using the camphor and some dry brush he had collected, the time traveler starts a large fire to guard them retreat into the woods. It spreads quickly. He and Veena proceed at a rapid pace, but eventually find themselves surrounded by Morlocks. The time traveler hurriedly starts some more fire, pulling down dry timber to feed the flames. Incredibly tired, nods off to sleep, feeling safe by the fire. He goes into sleep. When he awakes to feel the Morlocks grasping him, he swings a lever wildly, killing a few Morlocks. Suddenly, a rest flee. The few Morlocks dies and the rest flee, and he sees that the first fire has become a giant fast fire. Once he sets the forest on fire, it started. He can't find Veena anywhere and he runs after the Morlocks, hoping that they will lead him to safety. The chapter 13, the trap of the White Sphinx. The time travel comes to a clearing with a large hill filled with the confused, blinded Morlocks. They are helpless. When the morning comes, he gets his bearings atop the hill and heads back to the direction of the White Sphinx statue, where he was first landed on his time machine. He plans to pry open the pedestal with his liver, which he gained from the museum. When he arrives, to his surprise, the pedestal is open and he sees his time machine inside. He smells, guessing that at the Morlock's plan of action. He walks into the pedestal and the panels slide shut behind him. Just as he had suspected, he confidently begins to strike a match, but realizes he has nothing to strike it against. The Morlocks pounce and he desperately struggles onto the saddle of the machine, barely screaming in the forward lever. He pushes it forward and escapes into the future. The time travel flies into the future with a greater velocity than before. Although he is traveling thousands of years per second, he begins to notice the day and night again. The sun grows larger and redder. Finally, it seems that the earth has stopped rotating and is circling the dying sun as the moon used to circle the earth. When he brings the machine to a stop, he finds himself on a sloping beach. Vegetation covers every surface facing the unmoving sun. The air is very thin. Behind him, he sees a huge white butterfly in the distance, and slowly a red rock begins to move towards him. It turns out to be a giant crab. He hurriedly skips a month into the future to escape. He goes on stopping every 100 years or so, watching the earth ebb away. Finally, 30 million years into the future, he comes to a stop. A large disk begins to eclipse the sun. The time travel suspects that some inner planet, perhaps Mercury, is eclipsing the sun. The chapter 15, the time traveler's return. As he push pushed the lever forward, he started his journey back to the past or the present time where he started up, but instead he travels millions of years forward to find the society, but never gets down of the time machine, but he continuously travels. But when he pulls it back, he returns back to the place where he started. On the verge of fainting, he climbs back on the machine. As he travels back in time, he is eventually able to breathe with ease. He sees the dim outlines of buildings, and as he slows down, the walls of his laboratory again surrounded him. He sees his maid walk backward across the room. He stops the machine, stumbles out to check the date, and enters the dining room where he finds his guests. The guests are speechless and apparently very skeptical. For a moment, the time traveler's memory seems to falter. Overwhelmed, he rushes to look at the time machine, and there it is, covered with dirt and grass. The next day, the narrator returns, eager to speak to his host in the clarity of daylight. Having finished the adventure tale of the Ally and the Morlocks, Wells now turns his time traveler to adventures more directly related to time travel. Well delights to continue the discussions like a panel confrontation within a friend circle. In discussing the future in terms of astronomy and evolution, his imagery is closely related to the theory of entropy, the theory that the a universe will ultimately decay into a state of inert uniformity. The specifics of Well's pessimistic views of the future is admirable, but the fact that he includes science in his adventure's tale is remarkable in itself. Today, science fiction is a well established genre, but in his day, Wells was one of its first practitioners. In the epilogue, the time traveler is about to leave another journey and promises to back in half an hour with the hard evidence. But at the time the narrator is telling the story, 3 years have passed and the time travel has never returned back to his present. The narrator wonders where he could be and knows only that he has two very brittle, brittle alien flowers to show that time traveler ever happened. Proof that the human spirit of tenderness lives on even after strength and mind have decayed. Here, our chapter wise summary ends, and as well as the session ends comes to an end. Thank you, and we will meet in the next session. Thank you. That's all from me.